Welcome to Masonic Memories. Do you recognize any of the people in these pictures? Do you remember any of the events? Some of these people had prestigious positions in Grand Lodge. Others were wonderful ritualists, and others were the life of our parties. They all devoted a lifetime to our Masonic fraternity. Unfortunately, many were taken from us way too early. So sit back, grab a coffee, and listen to us reminisce about these amazing people who were such devoted members and contributed so much to our lodge. The owners of this house were the source of the Crist Perpetual Trust, which our lodge administers. Luther and Phyllis Crist lived in this house from the 1960s until their passing in the late 1990s. Listen to Gary Brown explain the origins of the Crist Trust. Hello, Gary. Today, can we talk about the origins of the Crist Trust?
Sure.
I heard it started with a poker game way back, maybe 30, 40 years ago. Can you talk about that?
Actually, it's right around the time of World War II. A group of young men from Marlboro would play nickel-dime poker, and they'd play like on Tuesday nights, and in alphabetical order, they'd go from house to house, and they'd play until 10:30, and at 10:30, the last hand would be dealt, or close to that. And then the host would have a snack, and everybody'd leave by 11.
And how did that develop into the...
Well, I played bridge with a couple of the guys that played this poker game, and from time to time they'd need a extra person, and they'd ask me to join the group. And at one point when I finished working overseas, I was here and had the time, and I joined full time. And I would host every 6th or 7th week. And that's where I met Skip Crist. And I met his wife, Dottie, at one of the Tuesdays when we'd meet at their house. And Skip's name was Luther, and Dottie's name was Phyllis. And Phyllis's brother couldn't pronounce Phyllis, so he always called her Dolly. So that's how she became Dottie, and I don't know how Skip got his nickname. But Luther and Phyllis were great hosts, and at a period of time, Skippy just couldn't follow the cards, and he dropped out of the game. And my wife and I would take my daughter down to visit from time to time. And as things got worse for Skip, he had to go to a nursing home. And this was hard on Dottie, and she took bad advice from her attorneys, and they talked her into selling 2/3 of her land. They had about 33 acres, and she sold 20 acres for very little money to a developer. But anyway, she made some bad decisions, and Skip finally passed, and my wife and I would take her shopping and would visit and, help her out as we could. And one day I went down and I went in, there was nobody there. So I did some checking and found out that these attorneys had put her in a nursing home. So I went to the nursing home, and we talked, and she was heavily medicated. And I'd been working with her for several months, and it wasn't like her. So I got Bay Path Elder Services, and they did a evaluation, and they determined that was she 100% no, but she was capable of taking care of herself with just a little bit of help. So we decided to fire the attorneys that put her in there and brought her home and got a new attorney and got a little help for her, and she was able to stay down in her home for another 3.5, 4 years, and it worked out pretty well. Uh, One of the things that bothered her late in life was she and Skip had no children. So she was afraid that when she died, that all memory of Skip and Phyllis Crist would die with her. And I convinced her that that wasn't necessarily true. We could take her estate and form a trust, and we could help people with that trust and tell people about Phyllis and Luther Crist when we gave people checks.
Now, that trust's official name is the Luther and Phyllis Crist Perpetual Trust, and it's administered by our lodge.
Yeah, once we established the idea of a trust, who would be best to administer it? And since it's a perpetual trust, didn't feel it was an individual. And since Skip was a Mason and Phyllis's brother and father were Masons, she felt it was a good place to care for the funds.
And who did you work with? How did you get that set up then into a trust? Was that a difficult process?
Well, I really didn't do that. We came up with the idea of the trust, and then I met with Worshipful Johnson, and he set the trust up for the lodge. That was his part of how this came to be.
And who's eligible to receive funds from the trust?
Well, anyone with a debilitating disease, most preferably Alzheimer's or dementia, as that was the impetus behind it originally, because that's what Skip succumbed to.
Any geographical limitations to this?
Well, we try and keep it as close to Marlborough as possible so it has the largest impact. You know, we have gone as far as Shrewsbury and Hudson, but we try to stay as close to Marlborough as possible.
Larry, I did a little bit looking at the records, and I don't have them quite up to date. But I believe you and I have probably delivered more awards than anyone else in the lodge by far. I believe you and I started in around 2000, the year 2000. And from my calculations, we gave over $350,000 to awards, if that's what we want to call them. And I would estimate that we probably gave out about 175 over the 19 years that I was involved.
Yeah.
And of course, you're still doing it, so you're still giving them down. So you're probably over 200 awards that you've given out. Are there any that stick out in particular to you?
Well, there was this one young woman who, in childbirth, they discovered she had terminal cancer. And when we made that bequest, she was wondering what they could use it for, and I advised her there's just no strings. We make no preconditions, and I suggested that possibly they take the family down to Disney World so that the kids that she had that were a little older could appreciate her for who she was before her health failed, and she did, in fact, the whole family went down to Disney World. And it gave me a lot of pleasure to see that the funds were used for something like that. Again, there's no precondition, there's no strings. They can use it for anything that they want.
Now, you talked a little bit about their house. They actually lived on Spring Hill Avenue, correct?
Spring Hill Road, yeah. It's a 1713 colonial, and it had been abandoned for a number of years. And Skippy put it back together and rehabilitated it. It was really spectacular. It was a Thomas Stowe house. Yeah, it's spectacular.
What is this Thomas Stowe house?
Well, he was a farmer, and originally it was much larger, the land holdings, and it was just a farmhouse, a colonial, 3/4, central fireplace, and then they added on from time to time, and it's just a great example of early colonial architecture.
Luther Crist, I believe he was a salesman, and I think you once told me about a story of him when he was in the nursing home and kind of hallucinating, perhaps, and you and him had a discussion to kind of cheer him up or be
Well, you know,
nice
it's
to him.
interesting. Alzheimer's is an amazing disease, and it seems to short circuit the brain, and he could not tell you what he had for lunch an hour ago, but he could tell you in 1939, when he and Phyllis were on their honeymoon cruise, the night they sat at the captain's table, who sat at the table and where they were from. And one day I went to visit him, and he's sitting in a chair by the window, and he gets up and sits in the chair next to him. He says, "Fred, I'm glad you came. I'm tired of driving." Well, I'm not Fred, but I just went along with it. So I sat down and I says, "Hey, Skip, great car." He says, "You know, with the war on, it was a bitch to get this thing." He says, and he goes on and on. He says, "Well, I'd like to talk more, but I got to prepare for this meeting." And he just tuned me out. I'm sure that he was at a particular point in time that I wasn't tuned into. And that's part of this disease.
Well, thanks to your effort, Skippy and Dottie Crist are still being remembered. And somebody once told me that people die twice. Once when they physically die, and once the last time their name is spoken on earth. And I think with Luther and Phyllis, their name will be spoken on earth for a good long time as we continue to administer this trust.
Well, that's the whole reason for the trust, and it gave her comfort knowing that this was going to come to pass. Again, it bothered her deeply that there were no children, and this is her child, this trust, and it perpetuates their name. And it's important for people to know that this is Crist money. This is not Masonic money. Not one penny came from the lodge. We're strictly the administrators of their trust.
Well, Gary, I think this was a nice description and a little nice history of the Crist Trust. Before we sign off, is there any other final comments or final points you'd like to make out about either Phyllis or Luther or the trust in general?
Not really.
Then with that, I'll say thank you for coming over, discussing this with me, and you and I will go out for lunch now. How's that sound?
Looking forward to it.
I hope you enjoyed this discussion. Stay tuned for more stories and tales about our lodge and its members. Take a look at these pictures. Can you recognize the members or identify the events that they were attending?